Maya Chun heard the whimpering before she saw the boy. The sound cut through the evening bustle of downtown Seattle, a desperate note that made her pause on the sidewalk outside the Korean Community Center. Three men in expensive suits had cornered a child against the brick wall of the alley, their voices low and threatening. The boy could not have been older than 8, his small frame pressed against the cold stone as if he could disappear into it. Maya's training kicked in immediately. 5 years of social work had taught her to read danger, and everything about this scene screamed wrong. The men moved with predatory precision, their tailored clothing and gold watches marking them as anything but ordinary street criminals. The child's terror was absolute, his dark eyes wide with the kind of fear that spoke of real understanding of what these men could do. She wondered if anyone else walking these streets tonight had ever faced such a moment, where every instinct screamed to call for help while knowing there was no time. Comment below and let me know where you are watching from, because courage looks different in every corner of the world. Maya stepped into the alley, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone carrying the authoritative calm she had perfected in countless crisis interventions. "I think you have the wrong person." The three men turned toward her, and Maya felt the temperature in the narrow space drop several degrees. Their faces were professionally blank, the kind of emptiness that suggested violence was simply another tool in their repertoire. The largest one, his neck thick with muscle, stepped forward. "This is not your concern," he said, his accent making the English word sound like a threat wrapped in silk. "Walk away." Maya moved closer instead, positioning herself between the men and the boy. The child had not spoken, but she could feel him trembling behind her. Her psychology training told her to assess, de-escalate, and protect. Her instincts told her these men were far more dangerous than any domestic abuser or street addict she had faced in her work. "I am a social worker with the state," she said, pulling out her identification with deliberate slowness. "This child appears to be in distress. I am required by law to intervene when I witness potential harm to a minor." The men exchanged glances, a conversation conducted entirely in microexpressions and slight movements. Maya recognized the communication pattern from her work with organized groups, the silent coordination that spoke of hierarchy and practiced violence. The boy pressed closer to her back, and she felt his small hand clutch at her coat. The largest man reached inside his jacket, and Maya's blood turned to ice. She had never stared down the barrel of a gun, but she recognized the motion from a dozen police training sessions. Time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat echoing in her ears like thunder. Then the sirens began to wail. The sound came from multiple directions, growing louder with each passing second. Seattle police patrol cars, their red and blue lights painting the alley walls in shifting colors. Maya had never been more grateful for the community center's security protocol, the automatic alert that triggered whenever someone used the emergency code phrase she had spoken in her phone while entering the alley. The three men melted away like shadows, disappearing through gaps in the urban maze that Maya had not even noticed. They left behind only the faint scent of expensive cologne and a small pile of items that had fallen from one man's pocket. A business card printed in Korean characters, a gold money clip, a photograph of the boy now trembling against her legs. Maya knelt beside the child, her voice soft and reassuring. "My name is Maya. You are safe now. The men are gone." The boy looked up at her with eyes that held far too much knowledge for his young face. He spoke in rapid Korean, his words tumbling over each other in his desperation to communicate. Maya caught fragments, her limited language skills picking up words like father and danger and please. She gathered him into her arms as the police cars arrived, their occupants spilling out with the efficient urgency of officers responding to a child endangerment call. The boy buried his face against her shoulder, and Maya felt the full weight of what had just occurred settling over her like a heavy blanket. Detective Rodriguez took her statement with the thorough professionalism of someone who had seen enough to know that nothing was ever as simple as it appeared. The business card and money clip disappeared into evidence bags, and Maya found herself agreeing to accompany the boy to the station while they attempted to locate his family. The child refused to give his real name, responding only to the gentle nickname she had given him. Jimin, she called him, and he seemed to find comfort in the sound. He stayed close to her throughout the booking process, his small hand never leaving her arm, as if she were his anchor in a storm he could not yet understand. Hours passed in the fluorescent limbo of the police station. Maya made phone calls to every Korean family services organization in the city, while Jimin dozed fitfully in the plastic chair beside her desk. The photograph from the alley showed him smiling in what appeared to be a formal family portrait, his resemblance to the man standing behind him unmistakable. The search for his father was beginning to feel futile when the atmosphere in the building suddenly shifted. Maya noticed it first in the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, how officers found urgent reasons to step away from their desks. The desk sergeant answered his phone with unusual deference, his voice dropping to whispers as he glanced repeatedly toward the lobby entrance. Then she saw him. The man from the photograph walked through the police station doors with the kind of presence that seemed to bend the very air around him. He was tall and lean, his movements controlled with a precision that suggested coiled power held carefully in check. His suit was impeccable, charcoal gray silk that looked like it had been tailored specifically for his frame, and his dark hair was swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble. But it was his eyes that made Maya's breath catch. They swept the room with the calculating assessment of a predator taking inventory of potential threats and escape routes. When his gaze fell on Jimin, sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, something shifted in those dark depths. The marble mask cracked just enough to reveal the desperate relief of a father who had been drowning in fear. Jimin stirred at the sound of footsteps, then launched himself from Maya's lap with a cry of pure joy. The man caught him effortlessly, holding the child against his chest with a tenderness that seemed to contradict everything else about his imposing presence. Maya stood slowly, suddenly aware that she had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple child endangerment case. The relief in the police officers' faces was too pronounced, their deference too absolute. This was not simply a worried father. This was someone who commanded respect through means that probably did not bear close examination. The man's eyes met hers over Jimin's head, and Maya felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. "Thank you," he said, his English perfectly enunciated despite his obvious Korean heritage. His voice was deep and controlled, each word measured with the care of someone accustomed to having his statements analyzed for meaning and intent. Maya nodded, unsure of the appropriate response. The man's gratitude felt dangerous somehow, weighted with implications she could not yet fathom. She gathered her purse and coat, suddenly eager to return to the familiar safety of her small apartment and predictable routine. But as she turned toward the exit, the building was suddenly surrounded. Black vehicles appeared outside every window, their occupants moving with military precision as they established a perimeter around the police station. Maya counted at least 20 men in dark suits, each carrying himself with the same controlled lethality as the three who had cornered Jimin in the alley. The difference was that these men were here to protect, not threaten, and they were all looking to the man holding Jimin as if he were their emperor, their general, their unquestioned leader in a war Maya was only beginning to realize she had stepped into. Detective Rodriguez approached cautiously, his earlier confidence replaced by the careful deference of someone who had just recognized how far out of his depth he had wandered. "Mr. Park," he said, the title carrying far more weight than simple politeness could explain. "Your son is safe to go home now. Jin-Woo Park." Maya repeated the name silently, testing its weight in her mind. She watched as he gathered Jimin's few belongings with the same methodical care he seemed to apply to everything else, his movements economical and purposeful. When he turned back to her, his expression was unreadable once again. But Maya caught something in his gaze that made her pulse quicken with an emotion she could not quite identify. It was not threat exactly. It was something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. It was recognition, as if he had been searching for something he had not known he needed, and Maya Chun, social worker and accidental hero, had just become the answer to a question he had not known how to ask. Maya had expected to never see Jean Woo Park again after that strange night at the police station. She was wrong. The envelope arrived at her apartment 3 days later, hand-delivered by a woman in an immaculate business suit who waited patiently while Maya signed for it. Inside was a check with enough zeros to pay off her student loans, her car, and probably fund a comfortable retirement. The accompanying note was written in precise English on paper, so thick it felt like fabric between her fingers. Miss Chun, it read, "Your kindness to my son cannot be repaid, but please accept this token of my gratitude. Jean Woo Park." Maya stared at the check for a long moment, then folded it carefully back into the envelope. She had helped a frightened child. That was what anyone should have done. The idea of accepting payment for basic human decency left a bitter taste in her mouth that no amount of money could sweeten. She tucked the envelope in her purse and went to work. The Korean Community Center buzzed with its usual afternoon energy when Maya arrived, children racing through hallways while their parents attended English classes or job training seminars. She loved the organized chaos of it, the sense of families building new lives from the courage to start over in an unfamiliar place. Mrs. Kim, the center director, looked up from her desk with unusual nervousness when Maya entered the main office. "There is someone here to see you," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "He is waiting in conference room 3. Maya found Jean Woo Park studying the children's artwork displayed on the conference room walls, his imposing frame somehow diminished by the bright crayon drawings of houses and families and dreams. He turned when she entered, and Maya was struck again by the controlled intensity of his presence, the way he seemed to fill spaces through sheer force of will. "You return my check," he said without preamble. Maya set her purse on the table and faced him directly. "I do not need payment for helping a child. Anyone would have done the same thing." His dark eyes studied her with the same analytical assessment she had witnessed at the police station. "Most people would have taken the money and convinced themselves they had earned it," he replied. "Your refusal is either remarkably principled or remarkably naive." Maya felt heat rise in her cheeks at the subtle insult. "I prefer to think of it as knowing the difference between doing what is right and being rewarded for basic human decency." Jean would move closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. Maya caught the faint scent of sandalwood and something else, something that reminded her of expensive whiskey and hidden dangers. He was studying her face as if trying to solve a puzzle that had been occupying his thoughts far too much. "You have no idea what you stepped into that night," he said quietly. "The men who threatened my son were not random criminals. They were sent by people who understand that the most effective way to hurt me is through those I love." Maya felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What exactly are you telling me, Mr. Park?" He pulled out a tablet and set it on the table between them, the screen showing security footage from the alley where she had found Jimin. Maya watched herself step between the armed men and the terrified boy, her own courage looking simultaneously heroic and foolishly reckless from this angle. "I am telling you that this footage has been analyzed by 3 different criminal organizations," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Your face is clear. Your actions are documented. You are now a person of interest to people who do not make distinctions between combatants and civilians." The room suddenly felt too small, the cheerful children's artwork seeming to mock the darkness that Jean Woo had brought into her safe, predictable world. Maya sank into one of the plastic chairs, her mind racing through the implications of what he was telling her. "Who are you?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would change everything. Jean Woo sat across from her, his posture remaining perfectly controlled even as he delivered words that would shatter her understanding of the world she thought she inhabited. "I am the leader of the BICO organization. We control shipping, construction, and various other business interests throughout the Pacific Northwest. Some of our methods exist in gray areas that law enforcement prefers not to examine too closely." Maya translated this careful language into plainer terms. "You run the Korean Mafia." "That is a crude but essentially accurate description," he acknowledged. "The men who threatened my son were from a rival organization attempting to establish territory in our region. They believed that harming Jimin would demonstrate my weakness and create opportunities for expansion. Maya felt as if she were hearing these words from underwater, their meaning reaching her through layers of disbelief and growing fear. And because I helped him, I am now, what, a target? Jin Woo leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on her. They will see you as either my weakness or my weapon. Either way, you are no longer safe to continue your normal life without protection. Maya stood abruptly, the plastic chair scraping against the linoleum floor. This is insane. I helped a lost child. That does not make me part of your world. The choice was removed from both of us the moment you stepped into that alley, he replied, rising with fluid grace. I am offering you protection because it is both my responsibility and my preference to keep you alive. The calm certainty in his voice made Maya's temper flare. Your preference? As if I am some possession you get to decide about? Jinwoo studied her for a long moment, something that might have been approval flickering in his dark eyes. You have more courage than sense, Miss Chun. That combination is both admirable and dangerous in my world. Maya gathered her purse and moved toward the door, her need to escape this conversation overwhelming her usual politeness. Thank you for the warning, Mr. Park. I will be careful. His voice stopped her before she could reach the handle. Being careful will not be sufficient. Maya turned back to find him closer than she had expected, his presence filling her peripheral vision like a storm system moving in from the ocean. The conference room suddenly felt intimate rather than professional, charged with an energy she could not identify, but dared not examine too closely. I have survived 32 years without needing protection from criminals, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I think I can manage to continue doing so. Jinwoo pulled out his phone and showed her a series of photographs. Maya's apartment building, her car in the parking lot, her walking to work that morning, unaware of the telephoto lens tracking her movements. These are taken today, he said quietly. My men are very good at surveillance. Unfortunately, so are my enemies. The photographs hit Maya like physical blows, each image a violation of the safety she had taken for granted her entire life. She sank against the door, her knees suddenly unreliable. What do you want from me? She whispered. Jinwoo put the phone away and stepped back, giving her space to breathe while maintaining eye contact. I want you to accept my protection until this situation is resolved. You will stay in my home, under my security, until I can neutralize the threat against you. Maya laughed, the sound sharp and brittle in the small room. Live with you? Like some kind of kept woman? Live safely, he corrected. Everything else is negotiable. Maya pulled open the door and fled. She made it exactly 4 hours. The men were waiting in her apartment when she returned from her evening grocery shopping, two shadows in her living room that moved with the same predatory grace as the ones from the alley. Maya dropped her bags and ran, her survival instincts overriding any thought of salvaging her normal life. She barely reached her car before Jinwoo's security team materialized around her, their black vehicles boxing in the entire parking lot with military precision. The men from her apartment vanished into the night like smoke, leaving behind only overturned furniture and the unmistakable message that nowhere was safe. Maya found herself in the passenger seat of an armored sedan, her hands shaking as Jinwoo's driver navigated through Seattle traffic toward an address she had never seen. Jinwoo sat beside her in perfect silence, his presence both comforting and terrifying in its absolute competence. The compound that became her prison was nothing like what Maya had expected from a criminal organization. The house was a sprawling modernist masterpiece built into the hillside overlooking Elliott Bay, its clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows suggesting wealth so profound it had transcended the need for ostentation. Inside, traditional Korean art hung alongside contemporary pieces, creating an atmosphere that spoke of cultural pride tempered by cosmopolitan sophistication. The floors were polished hardwood that seemed to glow with inner warmth, and the furniture was clearly handcrafted by artisans who understood the difference between price and value. Jinwoo led her through rooms that felt like museum exhibits, each space perfectly curated and meticulously maintained. Maya caught glimpses of staff members who moved with the same controlled efficiency as his security team, their deference absolute, but somehow dignified. "This will be your room," he said, opening a door to reveal a space larger than her entire apartment, decorated in shades of cream and gold that made the evening light filtering through the windows seem to glow. Maya stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the reality of what her life had become. "How long?" she asked. "Until it is safe for you to return to your normal life." "And when will that be?" Jin Woo turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "When I decide it is safe." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge and a promise. Maya realized with crystalline clarity that Jin Woo Park had not saved her life out of pure altruism. He had claimed her as completely and absolutely as if she had signed a contract written in her own blood. She was no longer Maya Chun, social worker and ordinary citizen. She was a debt that could never be repaid, a responsibility that he would never abandon, and a woman whose life now belonged to the most dangerous man in the Pacific Northwest. The cage was beautiful, luxurious, and absolutely inescapable. And as Jin Woo closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with the stunning view and the terrible knowledge of what she had lost, Maya realized that the most frightening part of her situation was not the danger outside these walls. It was the growing certainty that Jin Woo Park would never let her go, even if the threat disappeared entirely. And the even more terrifying possibility that she was beginning to understand why. Maya woke to the sound of screaming. She bolted upright in the unfamiliar bed, her heart hammering as she struggled to orient herself in the pre-dawn darkness. The luxury of her surroundings came back to her in fragments, silk sheets and cream-colored walls, and the terrible reality of why she was sleeping in Jin Woo Park's compound instead of her own small apartment. The screaming came again, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the house like a knife. Maya grabbed the robe that had been laid out for her and ran toward the sound, her bare feet silent on the polished hardwood floors. She found Jimin in his bedroom, thrashing against bedsheets soaked with sweat, his small face contorted with terror as he fought battles that existed only in his sleeping mind. Maya's professional training kicked in immediately, recognizing the signs of trauma-induced nightmares that she had seen in dozens of children who had witnessed things no young mind should have to process. "Jimin," she called softly, sitting on the edge of his bed without touching him. Her voice carried the calm authority she had developed through years of crisis intervention. "You are safe. You are home. The bad dream cannot hurt you." The boy's eyes snapped open, wide and unfocused as he struggled to separate dream from reality. Maya waited patiently while he oriented himself, her presence steady and reassuring in the chaos of his awakening fear. "Maya," he whispered, his English accented but clear. "The bad men came back. They had guns and they wanted to hurt Papa." Maya felt her heart break for this child who had been forced to carry burdens that would challenge most adults. She knew better than to dismiss his fears or offer empty reassurances that everything would be fine. In Jimin's world, bad men with guns were not imaginary monsters, but documented threats that required constant vigilance. "Tell me about the dream," she said instead, settling more comfortably on the bed while maintaining the respectful distance that trauma victims needed to feel safe. Jimin described images that painted a vivid picture of a child who had witnessed far more violence than Maya had initially realized. His nightmares were populated by faceless men who moved through shadows, always hunting, always dangerous, always seeking to destroy the family he desperately needed to protect. As he talked, Maya became aware of another presence in the doorway. Jin Woo stood in the hallway shadows, his silhouette rigid with the controlled tension of a man watching his child suffer and knowing that all his power could not fix this particular wound. When Jimin finally drifted back to sleep, Maya tucked the blankets around his small frame and followed Jin Woo out into the corridor. They walked in silence to the kitchen, a space that managed to feel both luxurious and homey with its granite counters and traditional Korean pottery displayed alongside modern appliances. How often, Maya asked as Jin-woo prepared tea with movements that spoke of ritual and the need for familiar comfort. 3 or 4 times a week, he replied, his voice carefully neutral. The doctors say it is normal for children who have experienced trauma. They prescribe medication to help him sleep. Maya accepted the cup of tea he offered, breathing in the subtle floral scent that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. Medication can help with symptoms, she said carefully, but it does not address the underlying fear that creates the nightmares. Jin-woo sat across from her at the kitchen island, his posture perfect despite the early hour and his obvious exhaustion. What would you suggest, Miss Chun? Your expertise in dealing with children is clearly superior to anything I have been able to provide. Maya heard the defensive edge in his voice and recognized the frustration of a parent who would move mountains to protect his child, but could not fight an enemy that lived inside the boy's own mind. She softened her approach, understanding that Jin-woo's guilt was probably as consuming as his love. Jimin needs to feel safe enough to process what he has seen, she explained. Right now, he is carrying the weight of protecting you and your organization on his 8-year-old shoulders. He believes that if he is not constantly vigilant, something terrible will happen to the people he loves. Jin-woo stared into his tea as if the dark liquid might hold answers to questions he had been afraid to ask. His mother died in a car accident 2 years ago, he said quietly. She was coming to pick him up from school when a rival organization decided to send me a message. The crash was meant to look accidental. Maya felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush, the casual way he delivered this devastating information making it somehow more horrific. Jimin was in the car, she said, not really a question. He was in the back seat when the other vehicle struck them, Jin-woo confirmed. He held her hand while she died, trying to stop the bleeding with his school sweater. When my men found them, he was singing her favorite lullaby because she had told him it would help her go to sleep. Maya closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the image of a 6-year-old boy trying to comfort his dying mother with the only tool his limited understanding could provide. No wonder Jimin's dreams were populated by threats and violence. No wonder he woke up screaming about men who wanted to hurt his father. She has been trying to sleep for 2 years, Jimin said from the kitchen doorway, his small voice cutting through their conversation like a blade. Mama is still sleeping, and I cannot wake her up. Jin-woo's composure cracked just enough for Maya to see the grief that lived beneath his controlled exterior. He opened his arms, and Jimin ran to him, climbing into his father's lap with a desperate need for comfort that transcended age or pride. Maya watched them hold each other and realized that Jin-woo's legendary control was not the product of cold calculation, but of absolute necessity. If he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his grief and guilt, he would be useless to protect the son who needed him to be invincible. But Jimin did not need an invincible father. He needed a human one who could acknowledge pain and still choose love. Over the following days, Maya began to understand the delicate ecosystem of Jin-woo's household. Jimin was brilliant and sensitive, speaking 3 languages fluently and displaying an artistic talent that his father encouraged with the same methodical attention he applied to business strategies. But the boy moved through the house like a ghost, hyper-vigilant and anxious, constantly monitoring his father's mood for signs of danger. Jin-woo loved his son with a fierce intensity that was obvious to anyone who watched them together. But his grief had created a distance between them that neither seemed to know how to bridge. He provided everything Jimin could possibly need except the emotional vulnerability that would allow the boy to feel safe enough to be a child. Maya began to insert herself into their routines with the careful patience she had learned in her professional work. She helped Jimin with his homework, her social work background, making her comfortable with the multilingual challenges of a child navigating between cultures. She read him stories in English while Jin-woo listened from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Slowly, Jimin began to respond to her presence. He showed her his drawings, elaborate scenes that mixed realistic images with fantastical elements in ways that revealed both his artistic gift and his need to process trauma through creativity. Maya praised his work while gently guiding him toward images that expressed healing rather than fear. Jin Woo watched these interactions with the focused attention of a man studying a phenomenon he did not fully understand. Maya caught him observing her methods, analyzing the way she created safe spaces for Jimin to express emotions that had been locked away since his mother's death. One evening, as Maya was helping Jimin prepare for bed, the boy looked up at her with his father's dark eyes and asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Are you going to leave like Mama did?" Maya felt her heart shatter and rebuild itself in the space of single breath. She knelt beside Jimin's bed, meeting his gaze with the honesty he deserved. "I am not your mama," she said gently, "but I am here now, and I will stay as long as you need me." Jimin studied her face with the serious concentration of a child who had learned that adults did not always keep their promises. "Will the bad men take you away?" Maya glanced toward the doorway, where Jin Woo stood listening, his posture rigid with the weight of a question he could not answer either. She chose her words carefully, knowing that false reassurances would only damage the trust she was working to build. "Your papa is very strong," she said. "He has promised to keep me safe, and I believe him. But most importantly, you are not responsible for protecting the adults in your life. That is our job, not yours." For the first time since Maya had known him, Jimin's face relaxed into something approaching peace. He fell asleep without nightmares that night, his breathing deep and steady as Maya sat beside his bed in the quiet darkness. When she finally emerged from Jimin's room, she found Jin Woo waiting in the hallway. He led her to a part of the house she had not seen before, opening a door to reveal a room that was clearly his late wife's private space. Traditional Korean artifacts were arranged with museum-quality care alongside personal items that spoke of a life cut short too early. Her name was Soo Jin, Jin Woo said, his voice carrying a vulnerability Maya had not heard before. "She was a teacher before we married. She loved books and classical music, and she could make Jimin laugh until he could barely breathe." Maya studied the photographs that lined the walls, images of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to light up every room she entered. In one picture, she was holding a baby Jimin, both of them laughing at something just outside the camera's range. "She was beautiful," Maya said sincerely. Jin Woo picked up a small ceramic bowl that had clearly been crafted by hand, his fingers tracing its imperfect edges with infinite care. "She made this in a pottery class the month before Jimin was born. It was supposed to hold his first solid food, but she said it was too special for something so messy." Maya understood that she was being allowed into a sacred space, permitted to witness a grief so profound it had shaped every decision Jin Woo had made for the past 2 years. She felt honored and terrified in equal measure. "You blame yourself?" she said. Not really a question. Jin Woo set the bowl down carefully, his movements precise despite the emotion she could see building behind his controlled facade. "If I had been a different kind of man, they would still be alive. If I had chosen a different path, she would be reading Jimin bedtime stories tonight instead of sleeping in the ground." Maya turned to face him fully, studying the man who commanded empires but could not forgive himself for being human. "Your wife chose to love you knowing who you were," she said. "Jimin needs you to be his father, not a monument to your guilt." Jin Woo looked at her with something that might have been surprise, as if no one had ever suggested that his self-destruction was not the appropriate response to loss. Maya realized that his entire world was populated by people who agreed with him by necessity, who would never challenge his decisions or suggest that his perspective might be flawed. "He needs you to show him that it is safe to love people even when losing them is possible," Maya continued. "Right now, you are teaching him that caring about someone is too dangerous to risk." The words hung between them in the sacred space of his wife's memory, a challenge and an invitation wrapped in the kind of honesty that could either heal or destroy what was building between them. Jin Woo studied Maya's face, as if seeing her clearly for the first time, recognition dawning in his dark eyes that she was not just the woman who had saved his son, but someone who might be capable of saving them both from the isolation that grief had created. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and danger and the growing awareness that Maya-chan had become far more than a responsibility to be protected. She had become necessary in ways that had nothing to do with debt or obligation, and everything to do with the kind of healing that only happened when two broken people found the courage to trust each other with their wounds. Outside, night settled over the compound like a protective embrace, and for the first time since arriving, Maya felt like she might be home. Maya had been living in Jin Woo's compound for 3 weeks when she decided she could not spend another day as a beautiful prisoner. The breaking point came during breakfast when Jimin asked her why she never went to work like other grown-ups. His innocent question cut through the careful routine they had established, forcing Maya to confront the reality that she was becoming a fixture in a life that was not truly her own. "I need to return to my job," she announced to Jin Woo after Jimin had left for his morning tutoring session. "The community center is expecting me, and I have clients who depend on my services." Jin Woo looked up from his tablet, his expression shifting from mild attention to the controlled blankness that Maya had learned meant he was about to deny her something she wanted. "That is not possible," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a man accustomed to having his decisions accepted without question. Maya felt her temper flare at his casual dismissal. "I was not asking for permission, Mr. Park. I was informing you of my intention." The air in the breakfast room suddenly felt charged with tension, as if a storm were building in the space between their opposing wills. Jin Woo set down his tablet and gave Maya the full force of his attention, his dark eyes studying her with the analytical intensity of a predator assessing a potential threat. "Your safety cannot be guaranteed outside this compound," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "The threats against you remain active, and my ability to protect you diminishes significantly once you leave these walls." Maya stood from the table, her frustration finally overriding the careful politeness she had maintained during their strange domestic arrangement. "Then neutralize the threats. You claim to be powerful enough to control shipping and construction throughout the Pacific Northwest. Surely you can manage to eliminate a few rivals who are inconveniencing your life." Jin Woo rose as well, his movement fluid and controlled despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "The situation is more complex than you understand, Miss Chun. These are not street criminals who could be easily intimidated or removed. These are established organizations with their own territories and codes of conduct." Maya moved around the table until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes and smell the sandalwood scent that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Then help me understand," she said, her voice low and intense. "Stop treating me like a fragile ornament that needs to be protected from reality and start treating me like an intelligent adult who deserves to know why her life has been completely destroyed." For a moment, Jin Woo looked genuinely surprised, as if no one had ever challenged his authority with such direct confrontation. Maya realized that his entire world was populated by people who deferred to his judgment without question, who would never suggest that his decisions might be flawed or incomplete. The realization made her bold. "You have kept me prisoner here for 3 weeks," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "You have isolated me from my work, my friends, my entire life, all while claiming it is for my own protection. But you have never once asked me what I am willing to risk for the chance to live like a human being instead of a kept pet." Jin Woo's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the emotion building beneath his controlled exterior. "You do not understand the stakes involved," he said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that probably made grown men reconsider their life choices. Maya stepped closer instead of backing away, her social work training helping her recognize that his anger was rooted in fear rather than genuine threat. "Then explain them to me. Stop protecting me from information and start trusting me with truth." Before Jin Woo could respond, the breakfast room door opened and 2 men entered with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested urgent business. Maya recognized them as Jin Woo's senior lieutenants, men she had seen moving through the compound with the quiet efficiency of people who handled problems that required discretion. "Boss," the older one said, his English accented but clear. "We need to discuss the Chun situation." Maya felt ice form in her stomach at being referred to as a situation rather than a person. She started to leave the room to give them privacy, but Jin Woo's voice stopped her. "Miss Chun will remain," he said, his tone brooking no argument from either Maya or his men. "Continue your report." The lieutenants exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with conducting business in front of a civilian. "The woman has been here for 3 weeks," the younger one said finally. "She has seen our security protocols, met our staff, and observed our operational procedures. Her knowledge of our organization now exceeds that of most low-level associates." Maya realized with growing alarm that they were not discussing her protection. They were discussing whether she had become too much of a liability to remain alive. "There are concerns about her continued presence," the older man continued, his words carefully chosen, but their meaning unmistakable. "Some believe that the simplest solution would be to handle the situation permanently, ensuring that sensitive information cannot be compromised through future circumstances." Jin Woo's expression went completely cold, his voice dropping to a tone that made Maya's survival instincts scream warnings. "Anyone who suggests harming Miss Chun will answer to me directly," he said, each word carrying the weight of absolute authority. "She is under my personal protection, and that protection is not negotiable." The lieutenants bowed slightly and left the room, but Maya could feel the weight of their concerns lingering in the air, like smoke from a fire that had not been properly extinguished. She realized that her presence in Jin Woo's world had created complications that extended far beyond simple protection arrangements. "They want you to kill me," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Jin Woo turned to face her, his mask of control firmly back in place. "They want me to solve a problem that threatens the security of everyone under my protection. Your death is one potential solution, but it is not the only one." Maya felt something shift inside her, a cold clarity that burned away her fear and left behind pure determination. "What other solutions are you considering?" she asked. Jin Woo studied her face as if searching for something he had not noticed before. "Marriage," he said simply. "If you become my wife, your knowledge of our operations becomes protected by law and tradition. Your loyalty would be guaranteed, and your presence would be explained to both allies and enemies." The words hit Maya like physical blows, each one reorganizing her understanding of her situation in ways that left her breathless. "You want to marry me to solve a business problem," she said, not really a question. "I want to marry you because you have become necessary to both my son and myself in ways that have nothing to do with business," Jin Woo replied, his honesty cutting through the air between them like a blade. "The practical benefits are secondary to the fact that I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Maya stared at him, overwhelmed by the intensity of his declaration and the casual way he had reorganized her entire future around his needs and desires. The arrogance of it took her breath away, but underneath her anger, she could feel something else building, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of surrender. "You assume I would agree to such an arrangement," she said, her voice carefully controlled. Jin Woo moved closer, closing the distance between them until Maya could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I assume nothing, Miss Chun. I am asking you to consider the possibility that what has grown between us during these weeks is worth building a life around." Maya felt her pulse accelerate as she realized they were no longer talking about protection arrangements or business solutions. They were talking about the undeniable attraction that had been building between them since that first night at the police station, the way her breath caught when he entered a room, the way his gaze lingered on her face when he thought she was not paying attention. "You're asking me to give up everything I've worked for," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm asking you to build something new with me," Jin Woo replied. "Something that combines your strength with mine, your compassion with my resources, your understanding of healing with my ability to protect what matters." Maya realized that he was offering her partnership rather than captivity, a chance to transform his organization from the inside while maintaining the family they had begun to create with Jimin. But accepting would mean acknowledging that she had fallen in love with a man whose hands were stained with blood, whose world operated by rules that existed outside the law she had always respected. "If I stay," she said slowly, "it will not be as your captive or your ornament. It will be as your partner, with full knowledge of your business and equal voice in decisions that affect our family." Jinwoo studied her face with the focused intensity of a man making a calculation that would determine the rest of his life. "The dangers of my world do not disappear because you understand them better," he warned. Maya stepped closer until they were nearly touching, close enough to see her own reflection in his dark eyes. "I'm not asking you to make my life safe, Mr. Park. I am asking you to make it meaningful." The challenge hung between them like a bridge they could either cross together or burn completely. Maya realized that this moment would define not just her future, but the kind of man Jinwoo chose to become, whether he could evolve from protector to partner or remain trapped in the isolation that had defined him since his wife's death. Jinwoo reached up to cup her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the controlled power she could feel in his fingers. "You're the most dangerous woman I have ever met, Maya-chun," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. "And I find myself completely unable to resist that danger." Maya felt something inside her chest crack open, releasing feelings she had been trying to deny since the moment she had stepped into his world. "You are not resisting anything, Jinwoo Park," she replied, using his given name for the first time. "You're choosing what matters most." The space between them disappeared as Jinwoo kissed her with the intensity of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own desires. Maya surrendered to the heat building between them, realizing that some kinds of captivity were actually freedom in disguise, and some kinds of surrender were actually victories that changed everything. When they finally broke apart, Maya knew that her old life was truly finished and something entirely new was beginning. She was no longer a social worker who had accidentally stumbled into a criminal's world. She was a woman who had chosen to love a dangerous man and transform his empire through the sheer force of her refusal to accept anything less than partnership. The real battle was just beginning. Maya should have recognized that the spring festival at Jimin's private school was too perfect a target to ignore. The event was designed to showcase the academy's cultural diversity, with families gathering in the sunlit courtyard to celebrate traditional Korean arts alongside contemporary American activities. Maya watched Jimin demonstrate calligraphy techniques to younger children, his confidence growing with each stroke of the brush, and felt a fierce pride that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with love. Jinwoo moved through the crowd with his usual controlled grace, drawing respectful nods from other parents who knew better than to ask too many questions about his business interests. To any casual observer, he appeared to be simply another wealthy father attending his son's school function, his expensive suit and quiet authority marking him as successful but not necessarily dangerous. Maya had learned to read the subtle signs that most people missed. The way his security team positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the event, their casual surveillance creating an invisible perimeter around Jimin's activities. The careful route planning that ensured multiple escape options from any location. The radio earpiece disguised as a hearing aid that kept Jinwoo connected to his network of protection. She was beginning to understand that Jinwoo's world required constant vigilance, that safety was not a given, but an achievement that demanded both resources and ruthlessness. The knowledge should have terrified her. Instead, it made her appreciate the enormous effort he expended every day to create spaces where Jimin could experience normal childhood moments. The attack came during the traditional dance performance. Maya was standing near the refreshment table, chatting with another parent about Jimin's artistic abilities, when the first gunshots shattered the peaceful afternoon. The sound was unmistakable, sharp cracks that sent birds exploding from nearby trees and parents diving for cover behind overturned tables. Maya's training kicked in immediately, her crisis intervention experience overriding panic as she scanned the courtyard for Jimin's location. She spotted him near the makeshift stage, his small frame frozen with terror as costumed dancers scattered around him. 3 men in dark clothing were moving through the crowd with military precision, their weapons trained on specific targets rather than random violence. They had come for Jimin, and they had come prepared to kill anyone who stood in their way. Maya ran toward the boy, her only thought to reach him before the gunman did. She tackled him to the ground behind a concrete planter just as bullets began chipping chunks from the decorative stonework above their heads. Jimin clung to her with desperate strength, his body shaking as she shielded him with her own. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "Do not move until I tell you it is safe." Through the chaos, Maya could hear Jin Woo's security team engaging the attackers, the sharp exchange of gunfire indicating that this was not a simple intimidation attempt, but a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm his usual protection measures. She realized with crystal clarity that someone had studied Jin Woo's security protocols and planned this attack specifically to exploit weaknesses created by the public setting. The school building offered the only real shelter, but reaching it would require crossing 30 feet of open ground under active fire. Maya calculated angles and timing with the cold precision of someone who had worked in dangerous neighborhoods and understood that hesitation killed more people than bullets. She gathered Jimin close and ran. They made it halfway to the building before Maya heard the distinctive whistle of a bullet passing close enough to feel its wind. She shoved Jimin through the nearest doorway and followed him into what appeared to be an empty classroom, her heart hammering as she secured the door behind them. The building's fire alarm was screaming, adding another layer of chaos to an already nightmarish situation. Maya could hear footsteps in the hallways, voices shouting in languages she could not identify, and the ongoing percussion of gunfire that suggested the battle was far from over. Jimin was crying now, great silent tears that spoke of a child reliving his worst memories. Maya knelt beside him and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes with the gentle authority she had learned in her professional work. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through his panic. "Your papa is the strongest man I know. He will come for us. But until he does, we have to be smart and brave. Can you be brave with me?" Jimin nodded, his trust in her absolute despite the terror surrounding them. Maya felt the weight of his faith settling over her like armor, strengthening her resolve in ways she had not expected. They hid in the classroom for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to the sounds of violence echoing through the school corridors. Maya used her phone to send Jin Woo their location, praying that the message would reach him through whatever chaos was raging in the courtyard. When the door to their hiding place finally opened, Maya was prepared to fight for Jimin's life with her bare hands if necessary. Instead, she found herself staring into Jin Woo's dark eyes, his face transformed by an expression of such raw intensity that she barely recognized him. This was not the controlled businessman who attended parent-teacher conferences or the careful father who measured his words to avoid frightening his son. This was the man who commanded criminal empires, who had built his power through the willingness to do things that other people could not stomach. This was Jin Woo Park without his civilized mask, and he was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. He gathered both Maya and Jimin into his arms, his embrace fierce enough to leave bruises as he assured himself that they were alive and unharmed. Maya could feel the adrenaline still coursing through his body, the barely controlled violence that he had unleashed to reach them. "Are they dead?" she asked, not needing to specify who she meant. Jin Woo's eyes met hers over Jimin's head, and Maya saw the answer in his gaze before he spoke. "All of them," he confirmed, his voice carrying the flat finality of absolute justice. Maya felt something shift inside her at his words, a recognition that she was not horrified by his lethal efficiency, but grateful for it. These men had come to kill a child, had been willing to murder innocent families to achieve their goals. Jin Woo had stopped them with the kind of decisive action that law enforcement could never match. She was not in love with a gentleman who happened to work in gray areas. She was in love with someone who would burn the world to protect his family, and she found that she had no moral objection to that level of devotion. The aftermath was handled with the same methodical efficiency that characterized everything in Jinwoo's world. The school was evacuated, statements were given to carefully selected police officials, and the media received a sanitized version of events that focused on random gang violence rather than targeted assassination attempts. Maya sat in Jinwoo's study that evening, watching him work through the logistical details of what had happened with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. She realized that this was what her life would look like if she chose to stay. Moments of domestic peace punctuated by explosions of violence that required absolute trust in Jinwoo's ability to protect what mattered. The knowledge should have sent her running back to the safety of her old life. Instead, it settled over her like a warm blanket, the understanding that she had found a place where her courage and compassion were not just valued but essential. When Jinwoo finally finished his calls and looked up to find her watching him, the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. "I could have lost you both today," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. Maya moved to where he sat behind his desk and settled into his lap, her arms encircling his neck with the natural intimacy of someone who belonged exactly where she was. "But you did not," she replied, her lips close enough to his ear that he could feel her breath. "We are here, we are safe, and we are yours." Jinwoo held her as if she were made of precious metal and dangerous explosives, his touch reverent but desperate. "I cannot promise this will never happen again," he said. "My world will always carry risks that yours never had to consider." Maya pulled back to study his face, seeing the man who had killed to protect her reflected in eyes that were asking permission to love her completely. "I am not asking for safety, Jinwoo. I am asking for partnership in building something worth protecting." When he kissed her this time, it tasted like commitment and gunpowder and the kind of love that existed outside civilized boundaries. Maya surrendered to the heat between them, knowing that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She was no longer Maya Chun, social worker and accidental captive. She was the woman who would stand beside Jinwoo Park as he rebuilt his empire around the family they were creating together, who would love him not despite his darkness, but because of the light it allowed him to protect. The war was over. The real life was finally beginning. Maya woke 3 days after the school attack to find Jinwoo sitting in the chair beside her bed, his suit immaculate despite the early hour and his dark eyes holding the weight of decisions that would change everything between them. "The threats against you have been eliminated," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had personally ensured that every loose end had been permanently tied. "The organization responsible for targeting Jimin and yourself no longer exists in any meaningful capacity." Maya sat up in the bed that had become hers over the past month, studying the man who had transformed from stranger to protector to something approaching salvation. She could see the exhaustion in the careful way he held his shoulders, the evidence of 3 sleepless nights spent coordinating the kind of systematic destruction that removed problems at their roots. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means you are free to return to your life," Jinwoo replied, each word measured and deliberate. "Your apartment has been maintained, your position at the community center remains available, and sufficient resources have been provided to ensure your financial security regardless of your choices." Maya felt something cold settle in her chest at the careful distance in his voice, the way he had retreated behind professional courtesy to offer her an escape from the world she had accidentally entered. She realized that this was the test she had not expected, the moment when Jinwoo would discover whether she stayed because she had no choice or because she had chosen him above all other possibilities. "And if I choose to stay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Jinwoo leaned forward, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior. "Then I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that choice," he said. "But it must be your decision, made freely and with full understanding of what you are accepting." Maya rose from the bed and moved to the window, looking out over the compound that had become home in ways she was only beginning to understand. She could see Jimin practicing taekwondo in the garden, his movements precise and confident as he worked through forms that would serve him well in the dangerous world he had inherited. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice carrying the weight of conclusions reached through sleepless contemplation. "About building something new together, about combining our strengths to create something neither of us could achieve alone." She turned to face Jin-woo, meeting his gaze with the direct honesty that had characterized their relationship from its violent beginning. "I love you, Jin-woo Park. Not because you rescued me, not because I am grateful for your protection, but because you're a man who would burn empires to keep his family safe while reading bedtime stories with infinite patience." Jin-woo stood as well, moving toward her with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something precious and potentially fragile. "And I love you, Maya-chan, because you see monsters and choose to heal them, because you walk into alleys to save children without considering your own safety, because you challenge my control and make me want to be worthy of your trust." The space between them disappeared as Maya stepped into his arms, her body fitting against his with the rightness of coming home after a long journey. But when Jin-woo moved to kiss her, she pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. "If we do this," she said, her voice firm with conditions that were not negotiable, "it will be as true partners. Your empire becomes our empire, your decisions become our decisions, and your son becomes our son. I will not be a beautiful ornament in your dangerous world." Jin-woo studied her face with the focused intensity of a man making promises that would bind his entire future. "You'll have access to everything," he said. "Financial records, operational details, strategic planning sessions. You will know exactly what we control and how we maintain that control." Maya nodded, accepting the weight of knowledge that would make her complicit in activities that existed outside legal boundaries. "And I will use that access to evolve your organization toward methods that build rather than destroy, that protect vulnerable people instead of exploiting them." Jin-woo smiled then, the expression transforming his entire face from marble perfection to human warmth. "You want to reform the Korean Mafia through social work principles," he said, amusement coloring his voice. "I want to create something that Jimin can be proud to inherit," Maya replied, her vision clear and uncompromising. "An organization powerful enough to protect what matters, but honorable enough to deserve that power." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet racing down the hallway, followed by Jimin's enthusiastic entrance into the bedroom. He launched himself at Maya with the uncomplicated affection of a child who had found his missing piece, his arms circling her waist with possessive determination. "Are you staying forever?" he asked, his English precise despite his obvious excitement. "Papa said you might go back to your old house, but I told him you belong here with us now." Maya knelt to meet Jimin's eyes, her heart breaking and rebuilding itself around this boy who had become hers in every way that mattered. "I'm staying forever," she promised, watching his face light up with joy. "But only if you help me convince your papa to marry me properly, with ceremonies and rings, and all the traditions that make promises permanent." Jimin looked between Maya and Jin-woo with the satisfied expression of a child whose deepest wishes were finally being granted. "Papa already bought the ring," he announced with 8-year-old authority. "He showed it to me yesterday and asked if I thought you would like it." Jin-woo had the grace to look slightly embarrassed at being exposed by his son, but when he pulled the small velvet box from his jacket pocket, his hands were steady with absolute certainty. "Maya-chun," he said, dropping to one knee beside where she knelt with Jimin, "will you marry me and help me build an empire worthy of the family we are creating together?" The ring was perfect, a single diamond surrounded by smaller stones arranged in a pattern that somehow managed to suggest both traditional Korean aesthetics and contemporary elegance. But it was the expression on Jin-woo's face that took Maya's breath away, the vulnerability and hope and absolute determination that spoke of a man who had finally found his anchor in the storm. "Yes," she whispered, then said it again more firmly. "Yes, I will marry you and love your son and help you transform your world into something beautiful and strong and worth defending." The kiss that followed tasted like promises and possibility and the kind of love that existed outside normal boundaries. Jimin cheered and threw his arms around both of them, creating a tangle of limbs and laughter that felt like the beginning of everything that mattered. 6 months later, Maya stood in the garden of the compound wearing a wedding dress that blended Korean traditional elements with contemporary design, surrounded by an unlikely congregation of criminal lieutenants and community center volunteers who had learned to coexist in the strange new world she and Jinwoo were building together. The ceremony itself was conducted in both Korean and English, honoring traditions while acknowledging the multicultural family they were creating. Jimin served as ring-bearer with the serious dignity of someone who understood that he was witnessing the formal creation of a security he had craved since his mother's death. Maya's work at the community center had expanded rather than ended, funded now by resources that allowed her to help far more families than she had ever imagined possible. The Biko organization had quietly shifted its focus from territorial expansion to community protection, becoming a force that criminal elements feared, while vulnerable families knew they could trust. The transformation had not been without resistance or cost, but Jinwoo's absolute support had made it possible to implement changes that other organizations would never have considered. Maya had discovered that crime lords were surprisingly amenable to reason when presented with data that proved ethical approaches could be more profitable than exploitation. Their first year of marriage brought challenges that tested their partnership in ways both expected and surprising. Rival organizations attempted to exploit what they perceived as weakness in Jinwoo's softened approach, only to discover that protecting communities required different skills, but no less ruthlessness than controlling territories. Maya learned to balance compassion with pragmatism, understanding that some problems could only be solved through methods that existed outside legal boundaries. Jinwoo learned to value collaboration over control, discovering that Maya's insights often led to solutions more elegant and permanent than force alone could achieve. Jimin thrived in the security they had created together, his nightmares fading as he learned to trust that his family was strong enough to protect what mattered without losing their humanity in the process. His art began to reflect hope instead of fear, bright colors and confident strokes that spoke of a child who finally felt safe enough to imagine beautiful futures. On a quiet evening 2 years after their wedding, Maya sat in Jinwoo's study reviewing proposals for a new youth center while he worked through security reports from their various enterprises. The domestic piece was punctuated by Jimin's piano practice drifting in from the music room, a complicated piece he had been perfecting for weeks. Maya looked up to find Jinwoo watching her with the expression of satisfied contentment that had become familiar since their marriage. "What?" she asked, recognizing the particular quality of his attention. "I was thinking about the night you saved Jimin," he said, his voice carrying the weight of reflection and gratitude. "How a single moment of courage changed everything for all of us." Maya smiled, one hand moving instinctively to rest on her still flat stomach where their second child was beginning to grow. "Sometimes the best things happen when we stop calculating risks and start following our hearts," she replied. Jinwoo rose from his desk and crossed to where she sat, his hands settling on her shoulders with the reverent touch of someone who had learned that the most precious things required the gentlest protection. "I love you, Maya Park," he said, using her married name with the satisfaction of someone who had claimed his heart's desire. "And I love you, Jinwoo Park," she replied, pulling him down for a kiss that tasted like forever and family and the kind of happiness that was worth fighting entire wars to protect. Outside, night settled over their empire like a protective embrace, and inside their home, the music continued to play, beautiful and strong and absolutely certain of its place in the world.